Rube Goldberg mechanisms to deal with this. One is a very favorite one in places like Montgomery County and other places, is so-called inclusionary zoning. And that roughly means that if a developer has zoning which allows 4 units per acre, that developer can have 8 units per acre if 2 of the units are for lower income housing, lower moderate income housing. So that there is no cost to this for the government. It's purely a reward for developers who do the right thing. Well, that sounds good, but if you remember, zoning is predicated on police power. The purpose of zoning is to prevent conditions that are unhealthy or unsafe, and congestion might be one of those things. But on the other hand, if it's okay for the government to authorize 8 units per acre, if 2 of those units are moderate income units, why wouldn't it be okay for the owner of the land to put up the 8 units to begin with? Which is to say, it wouldn't give what the government wants to have there, but it does seemingly undermine the notion that the purpose of having the 4 units per acre rule to begin with was to protect public health, safety, and welfare. Rather, we're creating something called regulatory property. Regulatory property can be beautifully encapsulated in the fact that how much would you pay for a little piece of tin you can hold in your hand? Not very much, right? But if you can bolt this to the hood of your car, and it's been stamped as a New York City taxi cab medallion, it's worth $200,000. Why is this piece of tin suddenly worth $200,000? Because you now can have a cab. But what makes the whole system work is government forbids people to pick up passengers for hire unless they have it. In other words, by not allowing private individuals to engage in what otherwise would be a perfectly lawful, useful business, they are in effect creating a monopoly and then sell monopoly privileges and can raise money. And affordable housing is very similar. Back in 1990, I attended some hearings of the President's Advisory Commission on Regulatory Barriers to Affordable Housing, otherwise known as the Kane Commission, named after former Governor Thomas Kane of New Jersey, who had been governor in 1968 to 1977, and later was president of Newark University. And that group, and of course, Governor Kane was very familiar with restrictions on housing, having observed it here in his home state. And that group concluded that states have not acted where local zoning has been extremely prejudicial to the general welfare. Basically, states have not required communities to allow more development than the existing residents would like to have, and instead they've been able to use exclusionary measures. And the report also indicates that things like gold plating of requirements for new subdivisions, having streets much wider and pavement much thicker, all underground utilities, amenities that might be nice to have but aren't really necessary, add something like 20 to 35% of the cost of housing. Why is it politically appealing to do this? Because this is a tax on new residents. New residents are just moving into the community. They pay this tax to their builder. They have no idea why they're paying extra money for housing. In short, there's no political lashback at the legislators who oppose this. Also in my area, we have a highway, I-66, which goes from the western suburbs into Washington, D.C. Arlington County, Virginia, which is a small county that used to be part of the District of Columbia before the government decided to need all of the original diamonds. This was the Virginia side. Arlington County did not want I-66 to go through that county into downtown Washington. The compromise was that I-66 would be high occupancy vehicles only during rush hour. The only highway in the United States where the entire road was for high occupancy vehicles. No one else could get on it. Now, from Arlington County's perspective, by making it more difficult for people to come to the area from further out, you're both reducing congestion, possibly in Arlington County, but you're sure making it more attractive to live there rather than having a comfortable commute from further away, thus having the effect of increasing housing prices in Arlington County. So my main message about affordable housing, for all these reasons among others, is that if you want to do it, just take your thumb off the scale. Let people build things. If people build things, more housing will become available, and before too long, more housing will therefore be affordable. I grew up not very far from here in Brooklyn, across Newark Harbor, and some of you may have grown up with what I'll call rent control. For those of you who are not from New York City, I will spare you the minutiae of the differences between rent control and rent stabilization. I'll call it all rent control to make it easy. And that's another way of having affordable housing. Simply have a limit on the cost of housing. Alan Winder, who was a professor of economics at Princeton, a very well-known liberal economist and formerly vice chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, said that liberals like him oppose rent control not because they're fond of landlords, but because they believe that controls impair both economic efficiency and social equity. Rent control is a sure way to ruin a city. When you push down the return to landlords, landlords stop doing maintenance, they stop investing in new housing. Being a landlord is not something that most people would want to go into, and so decent people are kind of pushed out of the business, and landlords therefore tend to become people who are at the bottom of the scale, so-called slumlords, but they don't have money to fix up the units. But this is an old story, nothing new here, and so this seems like a bad bargain for everyone. One more point to this is that once you control price, you're automatically controlling every other term in the entire relationship. Little story about a group of tenants at 3 in the morning. They're out there in their pajamas. It's cold, it's winter. They're huddled on the street. They have a few meager possessions with them. Behind them, firemen are pouring water on the steaming ashes of the apartment building. These people are grinning. They're all happy. Why are they happy? Because the landlord's building burned down. There's this kind of legendary animosity between landlords and tenants in places where there are price controls, caused by the fact that normally good tenants are valuable to have, because if someone has been there a while and proved themselves a good tenant, landlords want them to sign up for another term, maybe even cut them a little break in rent, because rather than risk a new person who might not be such a good tenant. On the other hand, if the tenant's happy with the place, the tenant's going to want to not annoy the landlord too much. So there's an equilibrium. People tend to work together. Once you've controlled the price, you've controlled the main residual term that gets people to work together. And so the tenant is there like a shop steward in a union printing plant with a book, the rules, telling the landlord you have to paint every 3 years, whether it needs it or not. The landlord, of course, puts on low-quality paint, and all kinds of things like this, because parties don't have any incentive to work together anymore. What about affordable housing for families in the suburbs? What about affordable housing for families who want a modest individual home of their own? Is that something government should subsidize? Why should government only subsidized housing in cities, in older traditional cities, for residents there. Why doesn't the suburban version of the good life apply too? Well, of course, largely it has. We've seen the rise of government subsidies for middle-class housing in the suburbs, largely through government-insured mortgages, and the reason why Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had the spectacular rise and fall they did was that these were private institutions, and people got very, very wealthy when the casino was in their favor. And then, of course, they overdid it and over-leveraged, and things crashed. And then the taxpayers are left with the wreckage of it. But the whole point is, this was put off budget to begin with. These were allegedly private agencies, so that the subsidies never were reflected on the federal budget, and therefore members of Congress never had to explicitly ask for tax money to pay them. And both parties were complicit in that, as is the case of most schemes that have gone on for a long time and are widespread. What happens when you redevelop neighborhoods? According to a piece that Howard Husak did in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago, neighborhoods branded as slums may well be better in important ways than their subsidized successors. In these, indeed, there are grounds to see in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a time when the private sector produced not only a large amount of affordable housing, but did so in forms that encouraged social cohesion, painfully lacking in government-built substitutes. Housing is a very fragmented market. Most landlords are not big landlords. Most landlords are non-pile landlords. And typically in inner cities, landlords were people from that very community who got a little capital together and who were able to buy a building and rent out some of the units to pay the mortgage, and they occupied one unit themselves. So there was a great deal of social cohesion. And of course, since they were all in the same community, it was pretty easy to observe what tenants were good tenants and what tenants weren't. People were able to look out for each other to a large extent. Compare that to the famous bulldozing and demolition through dynamite of the Pruitt-Igoe complex in St. Louis in 1972, where 33 huge high-rise buildings were destroyed, in large part because they had become such festering places of unwholesomeness and crime. Not far from where I live also, Simmons versus Parker was a case involving Southwest Washington, which had bulldozed urban renewal in the early 1950s. And there was a very interesting story in the Washington Post a few years ago, a long series of stories, talking with residents who really said they felt like they were better off in the old community than the sterile kinds of public housing that replaced it. Traditionally, bulldozing neighborhoods near downtowns has been associated, has been a big part of urban renewal, and many have referred to this as Negro removal, a term that Justice Clarence Thomas used in Keeler versus City of New London in his dissenting opinion, where he talked about the fact that historically minorities were the people who were pushed out by government urban renewal efforts. And there are a lot of communities where, of course, the gentrification that followed that gave the financial impetus for doing that. Now, here in New Jersey, of course, we have the famous Mount Laurel litigation. Is this something you're familiar with from your class? And Mount Laurel is a fascinating story of a suburban bedroom community, in this case of Philadelphia, which started to grow, tried to keep out low and moderate income people, and eventually the state Supreme Court adopted a sweeping scheme that created a Council on Affordable Housing, which served basically to try to micromanage this socioeconomic composition of communities throughout the state. Mount Laurel was good, I think, in that it certainly encouraged sensitivity